The Stalker. This isn't my story, but instead, my grandma's story. She told me this story a little while ago, after I asked her what was one of the most creepiest things that's ever happened to her. This happened to her over 8 years ago, at one of our local malls. It was around early December that month, and early evening, when my grandma had gone to the mall. She'd gone to the mall to do some early Christmas shopping that year for my family and some of her friends. She was at Macy's in the men's clothing section when it happened. My grandma was looking for some polos and pants when she noticed something out of her peripheral vision. She looks to see what it is and sees that it is a man staring back at her. She describes the man to be somewhere in his mid to late 40s. My grandma, being the kind soul she is, just looks at him, gives him a brief smile, and goes back to looking at the clothes. She eventually leaves the area and goes to the men's fragrance department to look at different colognes. While she was checking out the fragrances, she once again notices someone in her peripheral vision, but they're standing still this time. She looks to see who it is, and it's the same guy from earlier. She glances at the guy and sees that he's just looking at her with a blank, emotionless expression on his face. The Stalker. My grandma isn't a paranoid person and just chops the whole thing up as being one major coincidence. She stays in the fragrance department for another 10 minutes and goes to the women's section. After being in the women's clothing section for about 15 minutes, she heads over to the women's fragrance department. She's skimming through the different fragrances when she catches a glimpse of someone on the other side of the counter. She looks up out of curiosity to see it's the same exact guy again. My grandma could see the same blank stare he was giving her as he made his way over to the same side of the counter she was at. She watched as he came over to her side, but had stood about 20 yards away from her. My grandma decides to leave Macy's shortly after and head inside the mall to visit the other stores in there. She goes to the first few stores with no incident, but when she makes her way to the 4th store, that's when she notices it. She turns around to see the same creep from Macy's following her. A pit had begun to form on her stomach as she realized that this guy was bad news and very likely had ill intentions towards her. She goes in the 4th store, which thankfully the guy didn't enter, but she was a bit on edge because of it. This went on for a while, every time my grandma went to a different store, as the creep followed her, but always kept his distance. My grandma eventually made her way to the bottom floor of the mall. That's when she decided that she needed to find a way to get away from this man. She was looking around to see if anyone would help her until she spotted a security guard not too far ahead. She went up to him, explained her current situation, and asked him to see if he could escort her back to her car. The security guard agreed and had escorted her out of the mall and back to her car. The creep saw that my grandma was talking to security and stood. The Stalker. They're not going any further. While they were walking through the mall, the guy still followed them, but at a much farther distance than he previously did. During their walk through the mall, the security guy explained to her how my grandma did the right and how very lucky she was that day. My grandma questioned him, and the guy explained to her that apparently some lady was stalked through the mall and was abducted shortly after, a few months ago. Security went on to explain they never found the woman and have yet to find the person who abducted her. It wasn't until my grandma and security were almost at the exit that the creep lost interest and walked the opposite way where he was going. My grandma thanked the man, and the man watched her get to her car and leave the parking lot safely to make sure she wasn't followed. My grandma is forever thankful for security being around that day, as she firmly believes that it was her guardian angel protecting her. She also believes that if it wasn't set for that guy who helped her, she could have been abducted and been forced into a human trafficking operation and would likely never been seen again. My grandma didn't return to that mall for a very long time. After that, from out of fear, she goes to that mall occasionally, but only does when she either with my mom, her friends, or with me for her own safety.